In this chapter, we'll take a closer look at one of the more advanced components that comes with the Telerik UI for Blazor library, the grid. One of our new requirements for RPS Project Tracker version 2 is that the list of backlog items should be pageable and sortable. The grid can handle these features, as well as over 100 other features. You can find the documentation about all the features of the grid in the docs. Now, because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I suggest having the documentation and the demo sites open while you develop so that you can use them for reference. Let's take a closer look at the grid. The Telerik UI grid is a component that is designed to provide a solution for all your grid-related needs, and new features are constantly being added. We can't cover all the grid features here, but I will show you just a few of the most common ones in the next few lessons. I also recommend you take a look at the demos and docs for some more advanced grid features such as row virtualization. This is where the grid provides virtual row scrolling, so instead of using a pager, you can keep scrolling all the records in the data source. The grid also enables virtualization of columns. This means that columns and the corresponding data will be rendered only for the currently visible viewport. When changing the page or sorting the grid, fewer elements are rendered, which improves the responsiveness of the overall user experience. Then there's grid nesting, or grid hierarchy. This provides options for visualizing the relationship between parent and child records by displaying data in a hierarchical manner through the detail template. There's also grid state. In this course, you'll see examples of declaratively turning on grid sorting, filtering, paging, and grouping. However, should you need to perform the same operations programmatically, you can do that through the Grid API by using grid state. This will also allow you to know when the user performs a certain operation, let's say applying filtering, and it'll let you prevent or change the action. You can even save and restore the grid state for your users in case they need to leave a page in the middle of their work so they can come back where they left off and have the same page, same filters, groups, column sizes, and edits restored for them on the grid that they're working on. There's also frozen columns. This lets you freeze or lock one or more columns, which will allow the user to scroll horizontally through the grid, but still able to keep some important columns visible at all times, such as the ID or the command column. Alright, let's take a hands-on look at a few more features of the grid. Let's start things off with one of the most common features of the grid, and that's filtering. We want to be able to filter each column based on the data that exists in the column. Let's take a look at an example of this. In the components folder, backlog, and then items.razor. We're going to work here because this is where we have our Telerik grid defined. I'm going to run this just so that we can get reacquainted of where we are and what our project looks like right now. Here we are on the dashboard page. I'm going to head to the backlog page, and this is our grid. Right now we have sorting and pagination turned on. This is something we did in the previous chapter. Now we want to add filtering. I'm going to close this and let's head back to the code. There are two types of filters we can add, a filter row and a filter menu. First, let's take a look at a filter row. One of the attributes that I can add is the filter mode. We can define this as the grid filter mode dot, and you can see that we can either pick none, filter row, or filter menu. Filter row is the one we want to use right now, and just by adding this one attribute with this enum, we already get a filter in our grid. Let's take a look. I'm going to go to the backlog page, and you'll see that we have a row that's dedicated to filtering. You might also notice that I've adjusted the column widths just so that we can see all the UI for the filters. There will be more on column resizing in the next lesson. Generally, depending on what filter type you use, you might need to size your column appropriately. The filter automatically determines how to filter a column and what UI to present for each column. For example, in this first column, we have a drop-down that allows you to select from just 4 different values because there are 4 values available here. So for example, if I select PBI, you'll only see PBIs displayed. If I select a bug, then you'll only see bugs displayed. Let's go ahead and clear that. Same thing with priority. You'll have the different priorities that you can filter by, and that's just because it's a limited list. We get this drop down that allows you to do that. Now, an estimate is actually a numerical input. So you can see that we have numbers in there, and we can actually increase the value of the number. The list gets filtered by the number that we're currently on. And we have this little filter button next to there that allows you to say is less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and so on. So you can even create a condition. So for example, if I select is less than, that means all the items displayed are going to be less than the estimate of 9. You can also filter by a text value. So for example, let's say reinvent, and you can see that all the titles that have reinvent in them show up. Now I can actually change this from contains to starts with, and then nothing shows up. Here's that clear button that I was talking about earlier. I can press this and this resets my filter. Let's say I wanted to filter by B2B and then starts with, and I can type in B2B. You can see that we have 3 items that start with B2B. So that's row filtering. It creates a whole row that allows you to do the filtering. Now you might not necessarily like that kind of UI or want to take up the room that's required for an entire row. So if you're in that camp, there's another option for you, and that's the filter menu. Let's go back here to the code, and in the filter mode, we're going to switch this to filter menu instead. I'm going to go ahead and run this. Let's take a look. And just by doing that, we have a little filter icon that shows up instead of an entire row. And now you'll get the same exact benefits here of being able to filter, but now we get a menu pop up when you click on the icon instead of having it in a single row. So for example, if I want my value here to be bugs, I can filter and now we see bugs. There's other options here though. We can do Boolean logic. So let's say we wanted to have it be a bug, or we can have it be a PBI. So we want to see bugs or PBIs here, and then we have that. I can clear the filter, and we have similar options for priority. Estimate will have numerical field inputs, and the title field will have text inputs, and the date field will have a date picker. Now, small menu items like priority, for example, can have a different UI. We can use checkboxes if there's a small number of options. Let me show you how to do that. Let's find priority, and then here we're going to say filter menu type, and we can say filter menu type menu or checkbox list. I'm going to select checkbox list here, and now you can see the difference. Our priority filter will have checkboxes that you can check. So I'm going to select low and high and click filter, and now low and high are selected, as opposed to before where we had this type of interface with Boolean logic. There's another very powerful filtering method we can use with the grid, and it's a search box. So here I've added a grid toolbar template. This is just an area where you can add different tools to the grid. In this case, I've just added a search box. It's configurable, and you can take a look at the documentation for all the different features that it offers. But if you just put it in just the way it is, it gives you functionality to be able to search through all the different text fields. And as an example, we have the title field already. I've just added the description field from our PT items here as well, so we can have a look and search through multiple fields. So here's our title field. Here's our description field. If I search for example, network, anything that has the word network in it will be shown, but our descriptions are fake Latin here, so they're not going to have that. Let's take a look at Dolores, which is a word I see in the descriptions quite a bit. And as you can see, that does show up. So that's a pretty useful addition to the grid as well. You can also filter from code using the grid state that I mentioned earlier. For examples of that, take a look at the documentation on the Telerik Blazor site. If you have a very data-heavy grid displaying lots of rows and lots of columns, you might want to be able to create groups dynamically right in the grid so you have better visibility into your data. And Telerik UI for Blazor Grid allows you to do that quite easily. Let's open up the code, and right here on the Telerik Grid, we're actually going to add another attribute called groupable. It's just a Boolean value that we can set to true, and this will automatically enable grouping. Let's take a look. I'm going to head over to the backlog page, and you'll see a new row show up at the very top. It says drag a column header and drop it here to group by that column. Well, this is not a very data-intensive grid that I'm showing you, so instead we're going to take a look at the demos. I'm going to head over to the Telerik UI for Blazor Grid Demos, and under the grid section you'll find grouping. Here's an example of a grid that you can group. Let's take a look at some of these columns here. For example, discontinued. If I drag this column header and drop it right over here in this area, now you'll see that these data are actually grouped by discontinued. Here's the false section, and if we page a little bit, you'll eventually get to the true group. You can collapse or expand the group, and this will actually give you a summary of how many are in the category. Now, these aggregates that you see here don't automatically activate. If we take a look at the source code, here is the grid, it's configured, and we also have a grid aggregates element that we need to configure if we want the aggregations to show up. So The groupable attribute needs to be set to true. If you want to exclude certain columns from being groupable, like the product name here, for example, you'll set that column name to groupable false. And if we go back to the example, if I try to drag product name, I can't even grab it. It's not letting me because that column is set to groupable false. Here's another column that we can group by, category ID. I'll drag that over and you'll see that we have multiple IDs here. You can even create multiple groups. For example, I'm going to leave category ID up here and then drag over discontinued. Now we have multiple levels of grouping going on. So first we have the category IDs, and then inside of those we have discontinued false and discontinued true for that category ID. So that's grouping. If you recall from the filtering lesson, there was not enough room in one of the columns to display all the filter information. Well, the Telerik UI for Blazor Grid allows us to resize each column dynamically. If we go back to the code and change the grid filter mode to filter row, this will give us a separate row with filters in it. And some of our columns don't fit all the filtering information. So what we're going to do is actually use the resizable attribute here and set that to true so we can dynamically resize the column that doesn't fit the filters. I'm going to go back to the estimate column and I'm going to re-add the width for this column. Let's set it to 50 pixels. Let's run this. Here's our grid, and we have this estimate column that allows us to select an estimate, but it's hard to get to that clear filter button. But now that our columns are resizable, all I got to do is just drag out that estimate column and make it larger. So now we can see the value that we actually have in there, and we're able to clear it if we need to. So now all the columns are resizable, and you can drag the handles to select the right size that you want. The grid also has auto resizing. For example, this first column, if we double click here on the border, we'll get an automatically resized column. Let's try this with assignee, title, description. As you can see, now we have an automatically generated horizontal scroll bar because we simply have too much to fit on the page. This might give you an idea of how you want to size your grid, and or maybe you want to hide some of the columns if they're not necessary. But also keep in mind that if you do have to have a horizontal scroll bar, you can use something called frozen columns. In this demo right here, the first column is frozen, and when I do a horizontal scroll, you'll see that that column stays on the screen. Let's take a look at the source code for that. The way to implement the frozen column is you would set locked to true. We can do this in our own app. Here is the first column, and we can set locked to true, and now that column is frozen. You can also dynamically change the order of the columns in the grid, and that's also pretty simple to do just by, you guessed it, adding another attribute. So I'm going to add the reorderable attribute and set it to true. Let's see that in action. There's our grid, and now we have these handles when we hover over the column names, and I can move the columns in different slots. So you'll see that I can move the created date. I get a little triangle where I can drop that column, and the grid columns will be reordered for me. Why would we want to reorder these? Well, one is for display purposes, and another is if you are going to export the grid data and you want it to show up in an Excel file, for example, in a different column order. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at another powerful feature of the grid, and that's exporting to Excel. This can be done just by providing one more element inside the Telerik Grid declaration in your markup. So let's go to the code, and inside Telerik Grid, we're actually going to use a feature called command buttons, which we're not going to go deeply into here, but the Telerik Grid is quite extensible using command buttons, and you can read more about that in the documentation. So we're going to hook up one of the command buttons to give us the ability to easily export the data that we're displaying. I'm going to take advantage of another grid feature here, and that's the toolbar. Telerik Grid allows us to actually create a toolbar where you can host other UI elements. This will be another row at the top of the grid that you can use for hosting buttons and other commands. We're going to use it to host the grid command button. And the command that we're going to specify here is going to be called Excel export. This is all wired up behind the scenes for you, so you don't need to define Excel export. And this button actually has a text that you can set. I'm going to specify that as export to Excel. Now, when we run this, you'll see how easy it is to actually have this working. But we're going to come back and take a look at configuration of the export as well. On the backlog page, you'll now see a grid, and here is that toolbar row that we've created with one button in it, and that's the Export to Excel command button that we want to use. I'm going to click on it, and you'll see that this will actually download a new Excel file with the data that we specified here. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Here's the Excel file. Notice that the column order is exactly the same way that we are displaying it, and this ties back into our column reordering lesson from this chapter. So I'm going to close this, and let's say I wanted to sort the priority, and maybe I wanted to reorder this. Let's say I wanted the assignee to show up, and then priority, and then the estimate, and finally the title. Now I also maybe want to filter by the estimate, and I'm going to resize that column so we see it. You can see that all our features are now being helpful here. So now we have column reordering, column resizing, and filtering. And now I'm finally going to export my result to Excel. Let's take a look at that file. So here's the export. As you can see, we have the columns in the order that I've specified them. In other words, after reordering. And we're filtering by estimate equals 1. So we're only showing a couple of items here where the estimate is only 1. Now you'll also notice that we're only exporting one page here, and we have a lot more data there. If I clear the filter on the estimate, you'll see that we have over 10 pages worth of data. So where's the rest of the data? Well, we can configure our export to export all the data, and we can actually provide even more configuration options for the export. For that, I'm going to add another element inside the Telerik grid, and that's going to be the grid export element. And inside there, we're going to indicate that we want to further configure the grid Excel export. You can provide a file name that you want to use instead of the generic export. Let's call this RPS issues. You can also specify all pages, which means that now if you set this to true, not just the first page will it be exported, but all the pages will be exported. Let's go ahead and run this. All right, here we are on the backlog page, and you can see that we're showing page 1 of the grid, which only has 10 items in it. I'm going to click on Export to Excel, and we'll see that the name of the file that we get is actually called RPS-issues instead of that generic export file name. Let's open this up. You can see that we have a lot more data. In fact, all the data that the grid is showing, not just the first page. If you want to know more about export, take a look at the documentation and also the demos. One of the most powerful features of the grid is being able to edit right in line. At this point in our grid, we don't have editing capabilities. We have to go into the details page and use this form to do the editing. However, we can enable editing right in line here for certain fields and disable other fields. Let's go do that right now. Okay, here's our grid in the code, and there's a couple of different editing modes that are available. We can specify edit mode as grid edit mode, and then we can have none, which is the default. We can have pop-up, inline, or in cell. Now we need to be able to put the grid in edit mode, and there's many ways to do this, but typically you would add a column here. Right after all our other columns, it's a special column called grid command column. And this column has different buttons that we can enable to put the grid in different states. Let me show you. So here we're going to have a grid command button, and our first button will be, well, it's going to be the edit button, and it's going to call the edit command. So let's give it a name, edit. And if we take a look at this now, you'll see that our grid now has an extra column with an edit button. If we tap this button, you'll see that we have a nice little form here. We can update, we can cancel. Now, I'm going to hide some of these columns because I don't want them to show up. I think the form is a little too busy. Plus, maybe I don't want to handle the assignee editing in the edit form. In order to do that, I would have to set editable to false on an individual column. I don't want the assignee field to be editable in the form, and I certainly do not want the date created field to be editable for obvious reasons. I don't want people changing when this item was created, so I'm going to set that one to false as well. After that change, you'll see that we have fewer fields here, and these are the fields I want changed. So let's say I set that first one to a bug and click update. Well, nothing happened. It didn't change to a bug. That's because we need to handle that save event or that update event. Let's go do that now. Back in the Telerik grid component, we have a couple of events that happen. On add, on cancel, on create, on delete, on edit. These are all the different events that the grid can trigger, and you can handle those separately. However, the one we're interested in right now is on update. That's the button that we tap when we've modified a row and we want to handle updates. So I'm going to create a handler here. I'm going to call it the update handler, And let's define the update handler down in the code section right here. And this is going to take in a special argument. Grid command event args is the type. All the grid commands that we can define in that special column, we can have a save here or a cancel. They will all trigger a handler that you can define with the grid command event args as the parameter. So let's pull out our item from the args, and it's going to be args.item. This is an object, so we're going to need to cast it as a PT item. We're going to need to create the update item for our API to accept. Let's create a function called a 2pt update item and pass in that item. Now the RPS items repo that we have here, it has an update item method on it already that takes in instance of the PT update item. So we're going to pass that in and then simply refresh that grid. Now this function, 2pt update item, I'm simply going to just paste that in here. All it does is convert the PT item to a PT update item for our API. This item, by the way, is the item that has modifications already. Okay, let's take a look at this now. I'm going to hit edit, and then let's change the first one to a PBI and hit update. And there it is. It's a star now. You can also change its title, call it Alex Reinvent Networks, and let's set the priority to critical, update, and there it is. Now, if you wanted to do inline editing, you would set the edit mode to inline instead of pop-up. And then you need to add a couple of commands here, because without these, the edit button would simply disappear. And then you would be in a state where you can't do anything with the grid. So you need to add two more buttons here, a save button and a cancel button. The show in edit means these will only show up when you're in editing mode. Let me show you. So here's our grid. Press the edit button, and now you can edit this inline. And as you can see, these two buttons, update and cancel, only show up when we're in editing mode. You can hit cancel and we're back to normal. Let's go back to edit, and let's say I change this to updated item, and let's set the priority to critical. Hit update, and now this item is saved. For more info on inline editing, as well as other edit modes, take a look at the documentation. In this lesson, we'll take a look at a custom command that we can place in a command column. We've already seen a couple of built-in commands like edit, save, and cancel. There's also built-in commands for add, delete. But there is a way to create your own custom commands as well. And in our case, the grid could get a little confusing because we have two ways to edit it. One way is inline by hitting this edit button that's inline, and it's going to give us a pop-up for editing. And another way is if we go to the details page. So I can click anywhere on this row, and it's going to take me to the details page for that item. Instead of the row click handler, let's handle this using a custom command. So here in the grid command column, I'm going to add one more command here. And let's keep this one a little bit separately because this will not be in the final demo. This is just a demonstration here in the course. It's going to be another grid command button with a command that's going to be a custom name that does not match one of the built-in names. Let's call this one go to details, and we'll call this one details. Let's also hide this in the edit form. We don't need to show it in there. Now, here's where the difference is going to be. We need to define a click handler here. So we're going to specify on click, and let's call this go to details handler. So we need to define this method, and it's going to have a unique signature. So let's go down here to the code, and right over here, we have a series of row selected and row click handlers. We're just going to continue that. And this time it's not going to be private void, but it's going to be an async task. Go to details handler, and the parameter it's going to get is grid command event args. Call that args. Now, we've already done something pretty similar to this when we did the on row click handler. So really all we need to do is just copy this line, paste it in here, and args.item is in fact the item that we're editing. The item of that particular row, I should say. We're going to cast that as PT item, grab the ID, and pass it to the row selected function so we can navigate to the details page. Now let's go up here to the grid declaration, and we're gonna remove the row click handler temporarily here. And let's try this out. And here we are. Now, when we click on the row, nothing happens. When we click on our edit button, we get the pop-up, and when we click on the details button, we get navigated to the details form. So that's a custom command.